But with us then this afternoon is Jeff Heel, who is the Donald Waite Professor of Social Enterprise at Columbia Business School. He's a fellow at the Econometric Society. He's been advisor to the World Bank and the UN Development Program. Worked in a number of these related fields, economic theory and environmental economics. A number of books and articles, including Nature and the Marketplace, Valuing the Future When Principles Pay, and Whole-Earth Economics. He studied both economics and physics at Cambridge, where he received his BA, MA, and PhD. Also, Mark Jacobsen, who is an associate professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego, and also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research focuses on environmental regulation, taxes, and transportation, for one, and all of us who regularly drive our cars and turn 8 pounds of gasoline into 19 pounds of carbon dioxide regularly can learn a lot from him, I'm sure. And also environmental policy in the context of the broader economy. He did his PhD at Stanford. And then Bishop Richard Pates, who has been pastor and seminary rector and auxiliary bishop in St. Paul, Minneapolis, but is currently the bishop of the Diocese of Des Moines, Iowa. Since 2011, he's been the chair of the Committee on International Justice and Peace for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, a committee which assists the bishops both collectively and individually in advancing the social mission of the Church on these issues. He's a graduate of the North American College in Rome and holds an STL from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. So we have really highly qualified speakers to deal with this issue today of practical responses to the problems we've been talking about. And so I'll invite Jeff to come forward and start us off. Please welcome Jeff.
Hi, folks. Thank you for the introduction. Let me start off by thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's been a fascinating conference for me. I, of course, always enjoy listening to my fellow economists, which I do on regular occasions. They're endlessly fascinating to listen to. But I particularly enjoyed also listening to people with a very different perspective and a different sort of intellectual background on these issues. There's a lot of cross-fertilization going on in my mind at the moment. Not quite certain what will come of it eventually, but I'm sure it can't be harmful. I've got a somewhat ambitious agenda. I thought I'd try and give you Environmental Economics 101 in the next 25 minutes. Just to kind of go through the basic principles of why environmental problems occur and how we can go about solving them, how we can go about promoting environmental conservation. Very, very high level, more than the usual 35,000 feet, 50,000 feet maybe. But give you some sense of these principles. Now, why do environmental problems arise? What's the fundamental economic cause of environmental problems? And how can we go about correcting that? So, first of all, why do we have environmental problems? They all stem from what we call market failure, the failure of the market to do its good job properly. What do I mean by market failure? So, in this context, it's useful to recognize two distinct categories of costs: private costs and external costs. The private costs of any activity are the costs that accrue to the person carrying it out. So if you carry out an activity and you incur certain costs which you have to pay as a result of that, those are the private costs of the activity. The external costs of an activity are the costs of that activity that fall on other people, not on you. So for example, if I drive a car on the road, then I have to pay for the gasoline. That's a private cost. I have to pay for some wear and tear. That's a private cost. Maybe I pay some tolls, another private cost. But in addition to that, I'm burning fossil fuel, it's generating greenhouse gases, it's generating ozone smog precursors and a bunch of things like that. So it's changing the climate for everybody on the Earth, and it's polluting locally and affecting people's health, as you've heard from several earlier speakers. So there are costs associated with that. And those costs don't come home to me. I don't pay those costs. You guys pay those costs, the people who are affected by changes in the climate or by changes in the local atmosphere. So those are what we call external costs. They're external to me, they're external to what I'm doing, but they're generated by what I'm doing all the same. And so the environmental problems arise largely because of the existence of these external costs. and the failure of the market to sort of bring them home. Let me give you a more detailed example. We've heard quite a lot about this already from Michael Greenstone and from Rich earlier on. But let's talk about burning coal, which is one of the principal causes of climate change. And a utility burning coal has to pay for the cost of the coal, which is, it's a private cost, maybe it's $50 a ton or $20 a ton, something in that range. It has to pay for the delivery of the coal. It has to pay for the labour to move the coal around its site. It has to pay for the plants that burn it and the labour that manages those plants, and so on. And these are all the private costs of burning coal in a utility. And if you look at the utility's accounts, you'll see them all listed there. If you look at the accounts and you've got a cost of goods sold, you'll see the costs of generating electricity, and it will include all line items for all of these costs here. So these are all regular accounting costs, and you'll see them listed in the utility's accounts. Now, in addition to that, as we've heard multiple times, burning coal produces greenhouse gases. So every ton of coal produces 2.5 tons of greenhouse gases. So a big coal-fired power station burns about 10,000 tons of coal a day. So it produces about 25,000 tons of greenhouse gases a day, which for your, I did this calculation before, that's 7.5 million tons a year. So it produces greenhouse gases on quite a large scale. It produces oxides of nitrogen, oxides of sulfur, these various fine particles, PM 2.5, 5, and so on. And as Michael Greenstone said yesterday and Rich said again today, those harm people's health. So in addition to producing electricity, we're changing the climate and we're harming people's health in the local environment. And now these points in the second bullet point here, these are all the external costs of burning coal. The external costs of burning coal include the cost of changing the climate and the cost of having a negative effect on the health of people who live near the coal-fired power plant. Okay? Sorry. And so, these external costs lead to illness and early death. I mean, you saw Michael's figures, for example, Michael Greenstone's figures for the number of life years lost in China yesterday because of burning coal, somewhere in the order of 1 billion life years per year lost in China because of burning coal. And there are similar figures for effects of burning coal in this country. So it's the illness, the early death, and the change in the climate that constitute the external costs of burning coal. It's not easy to put a dollar value on those, but you can do that. You can put a dollar value on the change in the climate, or you can attempt to. It comes with a very large error bar around it, and you can attempt to put a cost to dollar values on the cost of illness and early death as well. There's a large error bar around that, but there's a principle of things which are quantifiable. Okay. Oops. Okay. So these are all the external costs from coal, as I said. Now, we use competitive markets to allocate resources in the US economy and in most Western economies because we believe that competitive markets are efficient. This goes back to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, and it's been a concept that's been formalized and tidied up in various ways a lot since then. So in general, there's a belief amongst economists that competitive markets are, or at least can be, efficient. However, what's significant about this external cost issue is that external costs prevent competitive markets from being efficient. So a necessary condition for markets to be efficient is that there be no external costs. In the presence of external costs, markets are not efficient. That's part of what's called the fundamental theorem of welfare economics, or the first theorem of welfare economics, formalized by people like Ken Arrow and Gerard de Breu. So, in a very fundamental way, external costs interfere with the efficiency of the market. What I mean by efficiency here, I'm using the standard economic concept of Pareto efficiency. A market is efficient, an allocation of resources is efficient if it's impossible to make anybody better off without making somebody else worse off. So if an allocation is inefficient, it means it's possible to make everybody better off. So there's slack in the system, there's obvious slack in the system in that sense. So external costs cause economic inefficiency. In the presence of external costs, we are in some sense wasting resources. We could be making everybody better off than we actually are, or we could be making somebody better off and nobody else any worse off than we are. So that's the cost of external effects, this economic inefficiency. So how do we handle this? I'm putting it in slightly different terms here. Let me just mention this. I'm piling metaphor upon metaphor here. When Smith had this nice metaphor of the invisible hand, what I'm saying here is that external costs limit the dexterity of the invisible hand and limit its capacity to handle our economic problems adequately. So how do we, what's going wrong here and how do we handle this? So let me give you a very simple example to try to bring home the idea of what's going wrong. The last couple of bullet points here give you a hint. They say what goes wrong, the reason for this inefficiency is that actors don't see the full costs of their actions. They only see the private costs, but not in general the external costs. The external costs are too diffuse, too far away for people to take those into account. And so they consequently underestimate the cost of what they're doing. So here is a concrete example. I have to choose between powering my vacation home with a diesel generator or solar power. Solar power, let's say, would cost me 20 cents a kilowatt hour. Roof-mounted panels, expensive. Diesel generator might cost me 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So it looks as if the solution is simple, the choice is simple. I pick a diesel generator because it's saving me 5 cents a kilowatt hour. But diesel pollutes, and solar doesn't. And the costs of pollution from diesel, the external costs from diesel, could be, let's say, 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So the total cost of diesel generation is 22 cents a kilowatt hour, which is actually more than the total cost of solar, which is 20 cents a kilowatt hour. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm the guy who's making the choice, I'm the guy who's paying the bills. Solar is more expensive than diesel, 20 as opposed to 15. Even though from a social perspective, from the perspective of all of us taken together, diesel is more expensive at 22 rather than 20. But if I'm just worrying about my own well-being and my own costs, I'll choose the diesel rather than the solar. I'll impose costs of 7 cents a kilowatt hour on the rest of you guys. So from a social perspective, I'm making the wrong choice. I'm choosing what is socially the more expensive option rather than the less expensive option. And that's the source of the inefficiency that arises in the presence of external costs. Okay, so what should we do about this and how can we handle this? So the standard economic solution is to what we call internalize the external costs. Internalizing external costs means sort of bringing them home to decision makers. Somehow making them aware of these external costs and making them take them into account. So one standard solution, in fact, the default economic solution to external costs is to levy a tax equal to the external cost. So in this example I just went through, where there's 7 cents per kilowatt hour of external costs from diesel generation, the government would impose a 7 cent per kilowatt hour tax on electricity generated by diesel generation. And if they did that and they put no tax on solar, then I, as the guy who was making the choice, would face a cost of 22 cents for the diesel, rather than the 15 cents if there's no tax there. And then in this case, diesel would be more expensive for me, as well as for society as a whole. And I would pick solar rather than diesel, and I'd make the right choice. So one way of fixing the problem, sorry, going the wrong way there. One way of fixing the problem is to put a tax equal to the external cost. That's what we call a Pigouvian tax in honor of Arthur Pigou, who's the guy who invented the concept of external costs and taxes to correct them. And this is obviously the rationale for a carbon tax. For example, you've all read a lot about carbon taxes as a potential solution to the climate change problem. So the solution is put a tax on the generation of carbon dioxide equal to the social cost of carbon, whatever that is. And it's also the rationale for a whole range of green taxes that have been proposed in various contexts. And these are taxes which, in general, economists believe that taxes distort the allocation of resources and themselves introduce inefficiencies. These are unusual taxes because these are taxes which are correcting an existing distortion and are therefore themselves non-distortionary. So it actually makes a lot of sense from an economic perspective, for example, to replace income tax or corporate profits tax by taxes on carbon or taxes on other external costs. You're actually sort of getting 2 for 1 when you do this. You're dropping a tax which is distortionary and you're correcting a pre-existing distortion. So there can be a strong economic argument for using these so-called green taxes. But there are a bunch of other options. In fact, there's 4 or 5 other options. I mean, I said that the default economics way of dealing with external costs is through taxes. The default political way of dealing with them is through regulation. Politicians, when they see external costs, their first option is always to pass a regulation, what we call command and control. So that, for example, is the way we deal in this country with automobile emissions. And as you guys all know, automobiles emit, at least gasoline-engined automobiles emit a bunch of noxious gases, which can turn into smog, harm people's health, and so on and so forth. So there are limits on that, and those are controlled by regulation. There are just a bunch of regulations promulgated by the Environmental Protection Agency, which simply say a car shall not emit more than so many grams of SO2 per mile driven, or something of that sort. And as I'm sure you're all aware, Volkswagen recently ran foul of those regulations in a rather spectacular way. So that's our default way of politically of dealing with external costs. And in general, although it's an intuitively obvious way of dealing with them, it's not a particularly cost-effective way of dealing with them. For example, there have been several. And the other thing we deal with regulations in this country is vehicle fuel efficiency. Vehicle fuel efficiency is controlled by the CAFE standards, corporate average fuel efficiency standards. And as you know, the Obama administration has raised those quite sharply. And within about 5 or 6 years, I think the average fuel efficiency of new vehicles on the road will have to be somewhere in excess of 50 miles per gallon, which is a remarkable change from its historical values. Now, if that regulation is enforced, it will certainly achieve its goal. But the question one can reasonably ask is, at what cost? And there's been several studies which suggest that the cost of reaching the goals by regulation in this sort of context are very high. That you can ask, what is it costing us to cut back each ton of CO2 that's emitted? Or what's the marginal cost of restricting emissions of CO2 by this kind of regulatory framework? And several estimates suggest that it's well over $100 a ton of CO2. Now, there are many much less expensive ways of reducing CO2 emissions. So that's a strike against regulation. And this is a real issue. I mean, the US produces about 6 billion tons of CO2 a year. If we're going to meet the 2-degree target, we have to reduce that by about 5 billion tons to 1 billion tons. So we're cutting CO2 emissions by 5 billion tons potentially. And if you spend an extra $100 on each of those, that's $500 billion. It's a lot of money to waste. So it matters that you get this stuff done in a reasonably cost-effective way. And regulation in general is not cost-effective, although there are certainly some exceptions probably where it is. The other option, of course, is cap and trade. We had a discussion about that earlier in the day. Used in California as a way of controlling CO2 emissions, used in the northeastern states of the US, the New England states, and New York as a way of controlling CO2 emissions, and of course used throughout the whole of Western Europe. The European Union's emission trading scheme is a cap and trade system for controlling CO2 emissions. So that's quite widely used. Another way of dealing with this, perhaps less obvious, is through legal liability. You can simply say to people, if someone imposes an external cost on you, then you can sue them and ask for compensation. That system exists here in the US, and you're all, I'm sure, very familiar with, for example, the pollution of the Gulf of Mexico a couple of years ago by BP when the oil well blew out. And there were targets of massive lawsuits as a result of that, and have probably paid something of the order of $18 billion in damages to settle those lawsuits. And the Exxon Valdez oil spill many years ago was again, the Exxon was the subject of a range of lawsuits as a result of that spill, although the numbers were much, much smaller in that case. But anyway, this is certainly a method, potentially a method for internalizing external costs. It's not, I think, a terribly good one in many ways because it's just so expensive to operate for the law courts in this country. So you have to be very, very deep-pocketed in order to be able to take advantage of the legal system. And the outcome is somewhat stochastic, somewhat random. It's difficult to predict, exactly what damages you'll be awarded and whether you'll be awarded any damages or not, for that matter. But in principle, legal liability is a way which can internalize external costs. And another also somewhat less obvious one is this concept of activism, or maybe I should call it conscientious consumerism. Somebody mentioned this morning the idea of fair trade and people being willing to pay extra for goods that are fair trade. So that's what I'm talking about here. If you're concerned about external effects generated by a company, you can boycott that company's products. If you're concerned that a company is damaging the environment or it's damaging the climate, you can boycott that company's products. And plenty of environmental groups promote exactly that kind of activity. I have on my iPhones here, this is an iPhone 6 incidentally, which was much reviled earlier on in the day. I have on my iPhone 6 a guide, a thing called an app called the Good Guide. And if I open the Good Guide and I use it to scan the barcode on a product in the supermarket, it immediately gives me a little sort of summary of its environmental and social pedigree. It tells me, was this thing made with fair trade, what country was it made in, what are the environmental impacts of its manufacture, and so on. And if those are negative, it recommends me some alternatives that I can go to instead. So that's a way of facilitating consumer activism and enabling consumers to kind of boycott products that they don't like because of their environmental impacts of their manufacture. That's a very recent development. Something which has probably only occurred in this country in the last 5 or 6 years. But all of my students are very interested in this. Most of my students would have that app on their iPhones and would be quite conscientious about this and would always buy fair trade as opposed to non-fair trade and stuff like that. And the same thing, of course, happens on the investor side. There's been a significant growth of socially responsible investing in the last couple of decades. And indeed, the Catholic Church actually was one of the leaders in this field. The people who managed the money for the Catholic Church are often instructed not to invest in certain types of stocks. And a significant amount of money in the US exchanges now is managed by so-called socially responsible investment funds. And most endowments, both university endowments and foundation endowments, are managed along these lines. And many pension funds, for example, the TIA CREF fund, is managed along these lines too. And this is actually enough to have an impact. If you talk to chief financial officers of large corporations, they're aware of the socially responsible investment fraternity. And they like to have socially responsible investors holding their shares, because they're people who tend to buy and hold the shares and don't turn them over too much. They're not like hedge funds. They're not trying to make a short-term profit out of them. So they like to have socially responsible investors, and they will sort of pursue policies which they think are more likely to attract socially responsible investors. There's also a couple of recent econometric studies of the impact of SRI investment on share prices, which suggest it does have an impact. And that if you want to maximize your share price, then sort of following the behest of SRI investors is the right thing to do. There are actually two versions of this socially responsible investment. There's a company the company that you don't like, you can either boycott its shares or sell its shares if you have them already, or you can actually do the opposite. You can buy its shares, then use your position as an investor to harass the management. That's another form of activism. So, for example, Columbia has a $7 or $8 billion endowment, and we manage that according to sort of roughly SRI principles. And a number of years ago, we were concerned about the activities of an oil company. And rather than sell the shares, we decided to hold the shares and wrote a letter to the CEO explaining why we were unhappy about their activities and saying that we intended to introduce a resolution at the next AGM critical of the management in various ways, various environmental ways. And we copied that to every member of the board. And to my considerable surprise, and I was the chairman of this committee at the time, to my considerable surprise, a couple of days later I got a reply by Federal Express, which sort of ran to 2 pages of fine print, from the CEO, trying to justify what they were doing, and then saying, we would very much like to meet with you to discuss these issues. And eventually he sent 2 of his senior people down to Columbia to try to persuade us to change our mind on this. We didn't change our mind, he didn't change his mind, but it's interesting that they're willing to go to that level. I mean, if a significant institution takes issue with management's behavior, you can get their attention and obviously put these issues on their agenda. So the consumer investor activism, those are new developments, but they're, I think, interesting potentially. In this table, I've tried to summarize all these options here: taxes, cap and trade, regulation, liability activism, what we know about them. Taxes, I think, are the only ones that get good in all 3 categories. I categorize them according to, are they expensive or cheap? Do they do things in a cost-effective way or not? Do they actually achieve their goals? And are they transparent? Is it easy to understand what they're doing and how they operate? Taxes, I think, rank high on all 3 options. Cap and trade is good on a cost basis and good for effectiveness. I think where it lacks is in terms of transparency. A lot of people just don't understand cap and trade and what its implications are. That's true of politicians, it's true of regulators, it's true of some of the environmental groups. I mean, I'm involved in running a couple of environmental groups, and I always find that my colleagues somehow think that cap and trade is an endorsement of pollution, which is clearly not. We had that discussion earlier on today. I don't want to repeat it. But that means that the cap and trade system itself is inherently untransparent, and it needs to be explained to people if they're going to understand what it does. Regulation is expensive, as I said before, it's effective, but again, it's not at all clear how it operates in many cases. I mean, the people just don't understand fully the costs of regulation. So in that sense, I think it's a non-transparent approach. Yeah, the entries for liability and activism, frankly, are guesses as much as anything else. I think activism is probably cost effective. I think it's fairly transparent what's happening there. How effective it is, I've really left very little idea, so I've put in medium question mark, which is about as vague as you can get on that. So let me just, I've got a couple of minutes left, so let me just use a couple of minutes I've got left to try to talk about why conservation matters. Much of this has been touched on by other speakers, so I think it won't matter that I just skip most of this stuff. Conservation matters because without the natural world, we would all be dead. We would never have evolved in the first place, and if we had evolved in the first place, we'd be dead by now. The natural world provides a whole range of absolutely essential services for human survival. It provides the food we eat, it provides the water we drink, and it provides the oxygen we breathe. And you can't get much more fundamental than that, obviously. And we're damaging it. We're damaging it to the point where it may cease to provide at least some of these services for at least some of the people on the earth. And that's what you heard, for example, from Chris Barrett this morning. So this leads us to think of the concept of what I call natural capital. Economists think of the natural world as natural capital. Capital is an asset that provides a flow of services. So a security is a financial asset that provides a flow of services, namely a flow of dividends. A house is a physical asset that provides a flow of services. My iPhone is a physical asset that provides a flow of services, to get back to the iPhones again. So nature is an asset that provides a flow of services. Natural systems are assets that provide a flow of services. And they can be very, very valuable assets indeed. So for example, insects, birds and bats pollinate much of our food. You don't actually think of food needing pollination, but if you go back to your basic biology, most plants actually do need to be pollinated. Otherwise they don't fruit. And so, without insects, birds and bats that pollinate our food, we might well starve. So insects are actually extremely important to us. But it's a good example of an aspect of natural capital which you probably don't think of as having any economic significance whatsoever. The fact that bee populations around the world and bat populations around the world are crashing, and some of these things are nearing extinction, you would probably think of as having little or no economic significance. But it actually has great economic significance, very great economic significance, and great social significance too, because food shortages obviously have many, many knock-on effects. Okay, so I'm actually out of time at this point, so let me just end up by saying that this is getting back to some of the points that other speakers have made. I'm giving you here a sense of the value of natural capital, the value of the natural environment in economic terms. This is a totally instrumental value, obviously. This is a value that derives from what it contributes to human well-being. Other speakers have emphasized the fact that there may be intrinsic value in other species in the natural systems. And this is not in any sense in conflict with what I'm saying here. You can believe that other species have instrumental value and intrinsic value, and they're independent of each other, and you can add them up if you like. They're two different dimensions of value. They're not in any sense in conflict with each other. The fact that economists value things instrumentally does not mean that we do not value them intrinsically. I've been a bird watcher all my life and a nature photographer all my life. I put a huge intrinsic value on nature, but it's a different value from the instrumental value that we're talking about here. So those things are quite consistent with each other. Okay, I've slightly overrun. My apologies. Thank you very much for your attention.
So far, and I will try to be brief to the extent I can, although it's always tempting. I trust I'll be cut off here, hope to stimulate some discussion about policies that are actually happening, both with respect to carbon and then sort of in my own piece of this with respect to cars in particular. So there'll be some pictures of cars and things to look forward to here as we go. While they're working on that, I will say just briefly that the first part of what I'm going to say is we'll have a list of policies that's going to follow very closely to those that Jeff talked about. One piece that I think is particularly interesting in getting more attention in the economics literature has to do with bonds and environmental insurance. So this notion that you could force a company to either hold insurance or post a bond at the beginning of its activities, and then see sort of what arises as we go. And I think it's going to be interesting to think about going forward the role of that. All right, thank you. So the two main objectives, I think, of actually getting down in the weeds of these regulations. One, we want to solve the problem. So think about what the particular externality is that we are unhappy with. Are we unhappy with traffic congestion or the rates of asthma and heart disease? Are we unhappy with climate change? Figure out what the externality is that we want to fix, and then try to consider how to provide the incentives to solve that while avoiding adverse effects. And at the end, I want to try to get some discussion going on the policy burden on the poor, right? So there's a notion that particularly in countries like the US, poor people consume a lot of gasoline as a fraction of their income. They still consume less than the rich, but it's high as a fraction of income. How do we think about doing these policies in a way that doesn't affect the poor adversely? And then also things about employment and local industry. So what sorts of distributional effects do we want to consider? So very quickly on this, basically we have regulation. This is the go-to for any policymaker. They say, oh, there's an externality, let's regulate it and make it illegal. That's fine, it can be effective, but it is very costly often. It does not seek out sort of the cheapest way in many cases to reduce the externality. Fees or permits are better. Liability, if we get some time or there are questions on it, I'd be happy to talk about liability and insurance requirements, but we see less of that, particularly in the US legal system, and more of the first two. So when comparing these policies, these are just sort of some bullet points to think about. If you're faced with a trade-off between two policies, the first thing to ask, I think, is what types of incentives does it provide? Two basic categories. One you could call the technique or the care with which people treat the environment. So think of a regulation that reduces the amount of pollution per mile driven by a car. That's affecting the care with which that car drives, the technique with which that car drives. It might also be worthwhile to think about trying to reduce the scale of driving in the US. And so to what extent does the policy do both of those, or only one of those things is an important sort of way to judge, I believe, the policies. Cost to firms, implied property rights, so there's this polluter pays principle, the notion that if you're causing an externality, maybe you should be responsible for paying for it rather than the people who bear the externality, although this gets into property rights. Considering allocation of risk. All right, so if we don't stop climate change, the risk lies with humanity. If we spend a lot of money or put very strict rules trying to cause renewable power, for example, and it turns out that renewable power is really expensive and we can't get the cost down, industry just bore the risk of that, right? So changing policies changes who bears risk. Right? Some policies generate funds, some don't. We'll come back to that at the end when I talk about distribution. And then there are questions of feasibility here. So the first thing I want to do, I already sort of gave you this outline before the slides came up, but the first thing I want to do is talk about some policy experience in carbon and climate change so far, command and control policies, and then also incentive-based policies like cap and trade. And then I'll talk a bunch more about cars and the excitement surrounding things like the new cheap, by some standards, Tesla, and what's going to happen with the automobile fleet going forward. So the direct regulation that we see in climate change is actually enormous. It's everywhere. The light bulbs in this room may even be subject to the incandescent phase out. You cannot buy a 100-watt incandescent bulb anymore because someone decided that the externality was too big, right? And then this sort of regulation gets placed. Okay, so they're everywhere we look. There are building standards, energy efficiency standards, and then some that you may not even know so much about. Renewable portfolio standards are now in the majority of states in the US. This is the state saying that X% of the electricity we generate must come from renewables. No matter the cost, no matter the fact that maybe we could switch from coal to natural gas and that would already help. Natural gas is not a renewable, it doesn't count, it's not part of the renewable portfolio standard. All right, this is set at 30% in California for 2020, I believe. All right, some of these are very, very ambitious standards, bringing in renewables or zero carbon sources. Price incentives we see in a variety of places, countries like Boulder, Colorado, British Columbia, Ireland, right? So the interesting thing is that taxes are levied often at fairly small levels. Right? Boulder was in fact one of the first. British Columbia was also very early. So there are carbon taxes out there, and there's starting now to be some studies coming out of British Columbia. It's been in effect there for over close to 10 years now, thinking about what that's done to employment, what has it done to the sort of composition of industry in British Columbia to be facing a carbon tax. The economists sort of preferred instrument. Tradable permit systems, the two largest in the world right now are in the European Union and in California. All right, and I'll talk more about both of those. In particular, the Europeans were first in terms of a large-scale cap-and-trade system for CO2. I talked about this a little already today. It's targeted to fulfill their international obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. Covers electricity, industry, recently, and with some legal wrangling, parts of aviation. Interestingly, agriculture and gasoline are exempt. And Richard mentioned this in the answer to a question this morning about, well, what's an efficient policy? An efficient policy is one that attacks all sectors, or well, perhaps attack is too strong, that corrects carbon emissions in all sectors, right? So the harder you sort of push on electricity and heavy industry, the more expensive it is for those sectors. Well, maybe you're leaving things on the table for gasoline, where people could combine trips a little bit or drive a slightly smaller car. That's actually a pretty cheap way for society to conserve some carbon. So here's what happened in the first round of the European cap-and-trade system. This is you distribute some permits, people trade them, a price appears, and this price should provide the signal against the externality, right? And so a bunch of analysts ran the test. Do I have a laser here? Yes. So a bunch of analysts ran models at the beginning, and the price of these things is going to be about 25 euro per ton. Sure enough, the first trades were all between 20 or 25 euro per ton. Something big happened here. This was a release of information into this market about how many permits exactly there were and how many tons of CO2 exactly had been released in the previous year, and it started to look like there were a lot of permits. Some people didn't believe it, and yes, there really were a lot of permits. The price of these things went to zero. All right, this market was worth roughly $100 billion at its peak. All right, $100 billion was erased in sort of half a year or a year in this market. All right, these are large financial markets. You did not want to be left holding the bag in this market, so to speak. And in particular, if you're the type of firm that bought your permits ahead and then realized you could have paid nothing for them or pennies for them, a year later, you just lost a bunch of money, right? So a series of rhetorical questions here. We can come back and talk more about that market in a moment. The second round of the European trading system, so this was only the first couple of years of it, they ratcheted down allocations. They said, we gave out too many permits. All right, now you could argue that in the second round they were just unlucky, but the price went really close to zero again, this time because the financial crisis came in. People weren't demanding electricity, factories were closing down. You don't need permits. When you don't need permits, the price goes to zero and the incentive goes to zero. So we're now in the third phase here in 2016. Of course, they ratcheted down allocations more quickly. The head of the ETS, I've actually heard him speak, and he says, we're aiming for 20 euro a ton. This time we think we got it right. We think it's going to be 20 euro a ton, and that's what we'd really like to see. And of course, the response of the economists in the room was, well, if you want to see 20 euro a ton, put a tax on. Don't mess around with this permit trading system and then discover that there were too many permits. So we'll see in a moment. I have the price of permits yesterday. It's not 20 euro, but it's above zero. So perhaps there's sort of some improvement in this system. California has the largest U.S. effort to date. As I mentioned, CO2 trading commenced 3 years ago in 2013. Interestingly, in California, I need to consult with my political science colleagues how this ever got through, but refineries and the carbon content of gasoline is covered under carbon cap and trade in California, not in Europe, all right? Industry, electricity, and refineries are all included. You buy a gallon of gasoline in California, a few cents of that, it's not huge yet, but a few cents of that are going to buy carbon permits. And that, in turn, discourages people a little bit from buying gasoline in California. People buy slightly smaller cars, they carpool a little more. All of these things that we're hoping to happen perhaps are, or have been for the last 3 years, happening. It's this fellow who was the one who put the carbon regulation through. And the interesting thing, the reason why I particularly like putting him up, is that in most cases, the regulation in California, environmental regulation, is very simple. It says, clean up the environment a bit in some dimension. And then the agency gets tasked with how to do that. Schwarzenegger actually had written, as part of the sort of the bargain that was struck to make this regulation, had written in it that there will be financial incentives, economic incentives like cap and trade. And this is a main reason that we have a cap and trade system, instead of accomplishing all of our carbon reductions through command regulation like 30% renewables, no incandescent light bulbs, and so on. Right? So this perhaps was a win for economists. Here's what happened to the California carbon price. It was going to be about $20 a ton. That's what the analysts said it should be. And sure enough, the first trades were around $20 a ton. And it very rapidly started to go the way of the ETS and the way of a variety of cap and trade systems, except you'll notice they cut this graph off at $12 a ton. What happened, in California, there's a price floor. If the price of carbon permits starts to drop below about $12 a ton, fewer permits are issued in the following auctions and following years. The reason there's still some volatility is because the floor is actually indexed to inflation, and there's questions of what inflation will really do, but it's bumping along right at this floor. It's as if we have a carbon tax of $12 a ton because of the imposition of this floor, rather than letting the price and the incentive get to zero. So this is one of my favorite slides to put up in classes, and I updated all of these yesterday. Here's what you pay for a ton of carbon in various places around the world. Okay, so the European system, with its lofty 20-euro goal, you can buy a ton of carbon there for $6.59 yesterday at close of trading. In California, it's right around $12, which is our price floor. In the northeast of the U.S., this only covers electric power, incidentally, but it's about $5 for a ton of carbon in their trading system. New Zealand has had a cap and trade system in place for quite a while. It's about $10 a ton there. Okay, now what of the places that have taxed? Well, there does seem to be this desire. 20 is a very round number, a lovely number, and all the people who have put on taxes are putting taxes right around here. So Australia had a $20 a ton tax for 2 years. It was, of course, abolished when the conservative government took power. It may be coming back, we'll see. British Columbia has had one a little over $20 a ton for close to 10 years now. And Ireland has a 20 euro per ton flat carbon fee. Right? And all of these fees, you don't necessarily see some grand regulation or some massive switch to solar or electric cars or something, but I believe, and I think most economists and most people buying electricity or gasoline would believe, this is having an effect at the margin. People are saving some energy. They are trying to conserve a little bit. Right, there's also a bunch of voluntary systems, and I'm particularly interested to hear what this group has to say about voluntary systems. So the notion here is if you buy a ticket from American Airlines to fly somewhere tomorrow, or you go to rent a car from Hertz, there's a little checkbox often at the bottom that says, do you want this to be a zero carbon trip or not, right? And you can check it and you pay $1 or 75 cents for a rental car or whatever it might be. Where is that coming from? Those companies, American Airlines, Hertz, and many others now, go out and they buy so-called voluntary carbon reductions. And these are often things like planting trees, things like getting corporations to install, paying for a corporation to install rooftop solar or something like this, right? And the prices there are around $10 or $13 a ton. right? So we see carbon prices appearing in the world. They're not all the same. In fact, they're pretty far from being the same. But these are placing incentives, and I'm very curious to hear what you think. The first federal plan in the U.S., of course, is now sitting in the courts. Rule was completed in August 2015. Establishes state-by-state targets. The one thing I want to say about the sort of first federal plan is just to look at the cost-benefit analysis that was done and think a little bit about motivations and externalities here. So this is estimate of benefits of the Clean Power Plan. It basically shuts down a bunch of coal power plants in the U.S., causes us to switch more toward natural gas and wind and solar and so on. The globe gets about $20 billion in benefits from this in CO2, estimated benefits. Of this, the U.S. is getting a small piece, a couple billion, all right? The air pollution benefits in the U.S., these are health and mortality changes in the U.S., valued at $24 billion. And this is not yet counting so-called non-market benefits like improvements to visibility in our cities and our parks, to the extent we value the health of ecosystems or the health of the environment that we live in. There could be additional benefits. Cost is $8.4 billion. The interesting thing, estimated cost, a big number also, all right, but the interesting thing about this is that the cost is bigger than the CO2 benefits to the US. The cost is smaller than the CO2 benefits to the globe, but much bigger than the CO2 benefits to the US, right? However, and this is, I think, why they sort of, the bigger print number on the analysis is the 24 billion, which is the point that even if we don't care about the other countries and sea level rise and so on around the globe, this may be worth it for just in terms of reduced expenses on Medicare and Medicaid and health insurance and so on in the US. Incentives for technological change, I believe also to be very, very important in evaluating a policy. I won't say much about it here, except that direct regulation is fraught with danger. So California had a high-profile mandate for hydrogen cars a few years ago. The technology wasn't quite ready yet. It may actually be ready today, sadly, but now we're pretty far invested in electric cars, all right? And so trying to pick technologies in regulation can be a poor way to incentivize technology. Taxes provide a boost to new technologies much more generally. All right, so a few minutes now on cars. I own no stock in General Motors. They just happen to make a nice picture that shows that we really do have a lot of choices in cars. You can buy high horsepower, low horsepower, enormous pickup trucks, small SUV. In the US, we actually have one of the most diverse vehicle fleets anywhere. This is great from the perspective of individual choices about what car to drive, and I have a paper a couple years ago on safety that shows it is absolutely the worst thing you can do for accident safety is to have a diverse fleet, right? The mismatched accidents are by far the worst ones. All right, so Jeff mentioned fuel economy standards. Here's a picture taking you back to 1955, the sort of rise of the automobile. Cars were getting about 16, 17 miles per gallon then. Muscle cars became popular. That dropped to maybe 12 miles per gallon. And then we have the oil shocks. All right, so the price of oil changed dramatically in the course of a few years. The fuel economy in the U.S. This tells you that people respond to prices, incidentally, and that putting price signals through in the gasoline market changes things. And then we had this flat period here. Gasoline got cheap again. But what's going on? Well, this is where the fuel economy standards came in. We propped up that high level of fuel economy that resulted from the oil shocks. We didn't let that fall, essentially, through the use of standards. Here we are now. In 2016, up over 30 miles per gallon. The orange are the mandates that are in place between now and 2025. That's a pretty steep increase. Right? So a little bit more. So if we had a mandate here, how come if you look at this closely, you'll see it actually declines a little bit. Why were cars getting bigger? Well, this was the rule. 27.5 miles per gallon for cars and 20.6 for SUVs and pickups. So when you started switching toward lots more SUVs and pickups and fewer cars, the fuel economy in the fleet declined. Now I want to zoom in on 2016, so this is just the last few years, exact same data, just the last few years, okay? Here's the orange is the standard taking off. The blue is what we have so far. We're not actually improving, and we don't seem to be meeting the standard. So what's going on? Well, now instead of having two standards, one for cars and one for SUVs, we have a different standard for every square footage of vehicle, the width times the length of the vehicle. Okay, if you make a 40 square foot car, think of a Honda Fit or some of the smaller Toyotas, it's got to get 41 miles per gallon today. Okay, this is an average, high target. If you're making a 65 square foot vehicle, that's a pickup truck sort of size thing, or a reasonably big SUV, it's got to get 24. All right, so how is it that we can be so much below the standard? Well, of course, we're buying more 65 square foot vehicles that gasoline is cheap and fewer 40 square foot ones. All right, so this is to do with the lack of transparency and regulation, and the notion that regulation doesn't always do exactly what you hope. So what else do we do with car regulation? We try to encourage alternative fuels and technology. This is probably important. Through the 1990s and 2000s, ethanol flex fuel was rewarded very highly. If you could make an ethanol-fueled vehicle, it didn't have to be as fuel efficient, or you could make more SUVs and sports cars than the rest of the fleet. These days, starting next year, the incentive is all for battery electric. The incentive for ethanol is phasing out. Just quickly, the black line here, think of this as the incentive for ethanol. You can see that through 2015 drops to zero starting next model year. And look at the incentive for battery electric. It's going to be 2 or 3 times bigger than the incentive ever was for ethanol. All right, so we try through these regulations to change a lot of things about the fleet. So are we looking at alternative fuels in the future? Has anyone seen one of these? I'm gonna doubt it. All right, so we've all seen some Teslas driving around and some electric cars. This is the Toyota Mirai, the first production hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, mass market. Okay, you can go out and buy one of these today if you want. Interestingly, it's not going to get quite as much of a credit as an electric car because the mandates, the regulation didn't pick hydrogen this time. They picked electric, battery electric this time. All right, and so Toyota is very upset about this, of course, and I've had some conversations with their VPs on this subject, and they're hoping for a change, but we'll see. Right now, our rules are rewarding Tesla tremendously, and not Toyota for this. Okay, but now think about a price, a financial incentive. If gasoline were more expensive, people could choose whether they like this one or whether they like the Tesla, and what people would choose would presumably depend in part, at least, on whether they like the color options. It would depend in part on the cost of operating it, right? So you make one technology more expensive, and people will buy the other. The last thing I want to put up, sort of getting into distribution about cars in particular, is to think about the distributional effects on health. All right, so yesterday Ram told us about the damages being experienced by some of the poorest. So what does the distribution look like? This is what a gasoline vehicle driven in Atlanta run through incredibly detailed air transport models about which way the wind blows and how high things are and so on, how much damage it does in terms of PM 2.5. This is the thing that we now have evidence reduces SAT scores. If you're unlucky enough to take the SAT on a day when PM 2.5 is a little higher, you get a lower score. Okay, so this is what a gasoline vehicle does in Atlanta. What happens if I plug in an electric car in Atlanta instead? So I'll go back and forth between these a couple times. Here's what an electric car plugged in Atlanta does. There's no bright red spots anymore, so it's not doing tremendous harm in any particular county, but it's doing a huge amount throughout the U.S., and in particular, look at North Carolina. Okay, the orange, the biggest costs here are all in central North Carolina. Why is that? That's where the coal-fired power plant is that's charging the electric car, the typical electric car that we plugged in Atlanta. Okay, and so this regulation and this incentive right now, if someone buys a Tesla in San Diego, where I'm from, $7,500 of your federal tax money goes to them, as well as $2,500 of my state tax money. All right, so $10,000 tax credit for buying a Tesla in California or in Atlanta. All right, and what this is doing is exporting pollution out of the cities. Okay, and so interestingly, the point this paper, which is a wonderful paper, it's still a working paper, it's not quite through the referee process, but almost, is making is that for any given city, electric cars are wonderful. And even for any given state, I think 40 of the 50 states would benefit by passing big mandates and rules for electric cars because they export the pollution to their neighbors in many cases. Okay, so thinking about distributional effects of this is important. I'll go back and forth one more time. So there's Atlanta. The wind carries stuff a little bit, but most of the damage is in downtown. And here's the electric vehicle. And the other thing to think about is total damage from these things. So as the electric grid gets cleaner, the sort of average damage that gets exported will become smaller. If it's a natural gas plant in North Carolina instead of a coal plant in North Carolina, these little orange things might turn to yellow, but this fact that we're exporting the pollution still remains. We could be reducing the overall level, but we will always be sort of exporting it. Alternative fuels, I think, just a bit more on these, it's very important to think about where they're coming from, particularly in the sense of poverty and food needs around the world. So ethanol, which has really sort of gone out of favor, but you can see could see from the graph I put up quickly, ethanol was rewarded very heavily in this country for decades, using ethanol for fuel as an alternative fuel. Well, it comes from corn, sugar, switchgrass, other things. All of these things raise the price of food around the world. It might not be a huge effect, but it's actually becoming substantial as more and more of our food calories are going into our cars rather than as food. Right? Battery electric, it all depends on where you charge it. If you're charging it from coal, it's pretty much uniformly agreed now to be worse than the gasoline-powered car. The electric companies, by the way, would love for you to charge it with coal, and the way they accomplish this is by putting timers on so it charges up at night when the power is mostly coming from coal. If you charge it in the middle of the afternoon, you might be charging off natural gas, but that's more expensive for the power company. So there's an interesting problem in incentives there. Hydrogen cars, these are Toyota's model here. This comes mostly from natural gas, or more ideally from things like landfill methane. So there are lots of different fuels and different things out there, and I think that the transparency is really sort of key. I'm going to skip the cost comparison. I want to make a very quick point on used cars, which is that high MPG cars have much higher scrap rates than low MPG cars. So you want to think a little bit also in terms of car regulation about how long vehicles last. The bigger cars last much longer. Consumer protection is often cited as a big reason to regulate cars, this notion that people might not be understanding how much money they're spending exactly on gasoline, and the idea that people might be regretting their car purchases. It turns out, I'll show one more picture here. So this is what happens. Each dot is a used model, some sort. And the horizontal axis is its miles per gallon. And on the vertical axis is what happens to its price when gasoline goes up by $1. Okay, so what is this saying? A used Toyota Corolla gains about 15% in its price when gasoline goes up by $1. Okay, a used Ford Explorer, 10% of the value of that Ford Explorer gets knocked off as soon as the price of gasoline goes up by $1. Okay, what does this mean for the used market? These are exactly the incentives we want to transfer into the used market, right? If used Ford Explorers get cheap, they're not worth repairing quite as long. They tend to get scrapped more quickly. You increase the value of new Toyota Corollas and so on. Now let's think about regulation. Let's suppose we force car manufacturers to make lots of new Corollas and subsidize them, or new compact cars, and we obligate them to make fewer large SUVs. This has the opposite effect, all right? It makes new small cars cheap and easy to come by, so they're easy to scrap. It makes a big SUV a hard or expensive thing to buy, and so it has sort of the opposite effect of the price incentive. The other thing we can learn from that picture, incidentally, is to think about this consumer protection rationale. And it turns out that the change in the value of a used car is almost identical to the change in the future gasoline savings. So the fact that the Toyota Corolla got 12% more valuable when gas went up by $1, that's exactly because you're going to put, let's say that translates to $1,000, you're going to put exactly $1,000 less gasoline through that car than its competitors when gasoline gets more expensive. Right, electricity, I think, is probably a very different story, incidentally. People pay very little attention to their electric bills, and it may well be that some more education and more salience is needed there. So distribution, just a few quick points. I need to end on distribution, but rich households usually consume far more energy than the poorest ones. This is a point Ram made yesterday. But as a fraction of income, the middle and the poor may consume the most, and do, in fact, in the U.S. It's very different around the world. Gasoline tax incidence is regressive in the U.S. It affects the poor more than the rich as a fraction of their income, but it's highly progressive in India. All right, so it's no one-size-fits-all here on distribution either. All right, but taxes generate revenue. My last figure is that the actual distribution of a gasoline tax depends on how you distribute that revenue. Okay, just focus on one. If we pick one line out of this, it's this downward sloping one. The circles, this is a 25-cent gasoline tax in the US, and the vertical axis is dollars per year in sort of losses, economic losses to people from that. And we've got income deciles along the horizontal. If you levy this tax and give everybody a flat rebate on the proceeds of that tax, the poorest 40% of the population will benefit, and the richest 60% will bear that cost. So the point is just that even though the incidence or the first sort of sticker shock of the tax might be regressive, it all depends on what you do with the money. These taxes typically raise far more than enough revenue to undo any sort of distributional damage that might have been done by the sort of the first shock of the incidence of the tax. Right, so it's just a very quick summary. Standards, fuel economy standards, mandates for different special types of vehicles tend to be a lot more costly, maybe 3 to 5 times more costly than a gasoline tax. And pollution taxes in general and energy taxes, carbon prices tend to be regressive in their incidence, but they generate more than enough revenue to compensate for any regressive incidents, at least in our experience. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Delighted to be able to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I am excited to discuss the practical responses to the problem of ecological degradation, and I'm grateful especially to Tom Levergood and Michael Lachevalier for being invited, and want to congratulate them on 8 solid years of these conferences, which have been tremendous benefit, I think, to all of our community, and they have a continuing vision, I think, to bring the Catholic study and development into a greater academic culture. So we're grateful to the 2 of them and to all of their team that have made this possible over the years. As we have heard over the course of this conference, Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si is a clarion call for every person living on the planet to better care for our common home. Towards this end, the Holy Father recognizes the importance of socio-political and economic structures. Animated by Pope Francis' ecological vision, I think there are at least 5 ways in which American Catholics can practically respond to some of the economic roots of ecological degradation in general and climate change in particular. The first is insisting that political parties and candidates for elected office prioritize climate change mitigation and adaptation policies. The second is advocacy in support of the Clean Power Plan. The third is advocacy in support of local renewable energy and energy efficiency policies. The fourth is by sending market signals of support for clean energy. And the fifth is advocacy in support of the congressional funding for the Green Climate Fund. Although I will take each of these in turn, I would like to begin by briefly situating my suggestions within the context of Catholic teaching on economics and the market, at least a very short course. The Catholic Church teaches that human life is inherently social. As such, the Church insists that the good of each individual is necessarily related to the common good, understood as the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. And we will speak about the tradition, I think, over the course of this couple days, that we have seen how there's been a progressive understanding within the context of the ecological situation, beginning with Pope John Paul II through our friend Pope Benedict. And finally, I think Francis has been able to consolidate this into action, that he has really highlighted the issue and he's calling for action. So the Catholic Church affirms that markets can play a legitimate role in the promotion of the common good. As Pope John Paul II observed, it would appear that on the level of individual nations and of international relations, the free market is the most efficient instrument for utilizing resources and effectively responding to needs. At the same time, however, the Catholic Church has never taught that the free market is an unqualified absolute good. This is due to the fact that the market neither values nor ensures access to all human goods. In the words of Pope John Paul II, there are collective and qualitative needs which cannot be satisfied by market mechanisms. There are important human needs which escape its logic. There are goods which, by their very nature, cannot and must not be bought or sold. Additionally, as the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church recognizes, Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute and untouchable. On the contrary, it has always understood this right within the broader context of the right common to all to use the goods of the whole creation. The right to private property is subordinated to the right to common use, to the fact that goods are meant for everyone. As such, the Pope continues, the free market must be circumscribed with a strong juridical framework, which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality. In particular, he says, it is the task of the state to provide for the defense and preservation of common goods, such as the natural and human environments, which cannot be safeguarded simply by market forces. In other words, the Catholic Church, guided by the principle of subsidiarity, teaches that the state can and should legitimately intervene in the market when the market fails to protect and promote the common good. In terms of economic theory, the failure of the market to protect the environment, which is constitutive of the common good, is often due to the phenomenon of negative externalities, which we have been discussing in the last two presentations. In general, externalities are unintended consequences of economic transactions that are not reflected in a given price. In order to remedy negative environmental externalities, which usually disproportionately harm the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized, many economists and political theorists argue that unaccounted for socioeconomic costs associated with environmental degradation must be incorporated into the price of goods and services. In other words, many believe that the economic justice requires consumers to pay the full, true cost of the products and services they purchase. This is certainly the position of the Catholic Church, and it was especially well articulated by Pope Benedict. And I think it's been the discussion of the options that we have in order to bear that cost. In his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, Benedict recognized and insisted that society must make every effort to ensure that the economic and social costs of using up shared environmental resources are recognized with transparency and fully borne by those who incur them, not by other peoples and not by future generations. Here it is worth noting that the Pope Francis quotes this passage in Laudato Si and says that only when economic actions satisfy the standard identified by Benedict can those actions be considered ethical. Similarly, Benedict emphasized in his 2010 World Day of Peace message that when making use of natural resources, we should be concerned for their protection and consider the cost entailed environmentally and socially as an essential part of the overall expenses incurred. When the market fails to protect the common good by allowing externalities, the Catholic tradition insists that strong public policies and committed elected officials are needed to internalize the full cost of economic transactions. Again, in Caritas in Veritate, Benedict follows his identification of the need to internalize economic costs by saying that the protection of the environment, of resources, and of the climate obliges all international leaders to act jointly and to show a readiness to work in good faith, respecting the law and promoting solidarity with the weakest regions of the planet. Benedict followed his remarks on externalities by saying that with regard to true transactional costs, the international community and national governments are responsible for sending the right signals in order to combat effectively the misuse of the environment. To protect the environment and to safeguard natural resources and the climate, there is a need to act in accordance with clearly defined rules. Also, from the juridical and economic standpoint, while at the same time taking into account the solidarity we owe to those living in the poorer areas of our world and again to future generations. In sum, the Catholic tradition affirms the need for market interventions whenever negative economic externalities compromise the integrity of creation. Now we talk about climate change policies. In Laudato Si', Pope Francis recognizes that our common home is threatened by a host of socio-ecological challenges. These include pollution, water scarcity, biodiversity loss, rising inequality, decline in the quality of human life, and the breakdown of society. At the same time, however, the Holy Father echoes the insights of John Paul II and Benedict that climate change is an especially urgent threat to creation. This urgency, of course, is partly due to increasingly likely prospects that atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases will soon reach a tipping point, beyond which climate change will become runaway, effectively, therefore, irreversible. This urgency is also due to the humanitarian consequences of not addressing climate change. The World Health Organization, for example, reports that climate change already causes 150,000 annual deaths and could cause an additional 250,000 per year from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress between the 2030 and 2050. Additionally, the World Bank predicts that unaddressed climate change could force more than 100 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. For many experts, climate change embodies the phenomenon of negative externalities. This is due to the fact that many places, especially here in the U.S., the social costs of greenhouse gas emissions are not included in the price of market transactions, as we have just heard. Part of this reality is likely due to the persistent phenomenon of climate change denialism, which Pope Francis indirectly addresses in Laudato Si' by lamenting that often economic interests easily end up trumping the common good and manipulating information so that their own plans will not be affected. In response to externality-driven climate change, one way the U.S. government sometimes factors the social cost of carbon is by cost-benefit analysis of potential environmental policies. As defined by the Environmental Protection Agency, the social cost of carbon is an estimate of the economic damages associated with small increase in carbon dioxide emissions, conventionally 1 metric ton in a given year. The dollar figure also represents the value of damages avoided for a small emission reduction. In 2015, the social cost of carbon calculated with a 3% discount rate average was $36 per ton. Although the social cost of carbon is one useful tool with which to help internalize externalities associated with fossil fuel consumption, any effort to internalize the true cost of carbon must be operationalized through public policies in order to be effective. This is an insight repeated by Pope Francis throughout Laudato Si'. And here I offer what I consider to be some of the greatest hits that he made in this document in this regard. 1, there is an urgent need to develop policies so that in the next few years, the emission of carbon dioxide and other highly polluting gases can be drastically reduced. For example, substituting for fossil fuels and developing sources of renewable energy. Number 2, it is remarkably how weak international political responses have been. The failure of global summits on the environment make it plain that our politics are subject to technology and finance. There are too many special interests and economic interests easily end up trumping the common good and manipulating information so that their own plans, again, will not be affected. And enforceable international agreements are urgently needed. Some local authorities are not always capable of effective intervention. Relations between states must be respectful of each other's sovereignty, but must also lay down mutually agreed means of averting regional disasters, which would eventually affect everyone. Here in the United States, there have been efforts in a very possible way, again, as we have just heard, to internalize climate-changing negative externalities. First and foremost, it seems incumbent on Catholics, especially in an election year, to exercise faithful citizenship through insistence that political parties and all candidates for elected office exercise courage and moral responsibility by affirming the need for climate change mitigation and adaptation policies and making them a central part of party and personal platforms. As with all advocacy, this can be done through representation in parties and with candidates, and because it is a moral issue, that is how it affects our responsibility as Catholics. Although there is an arguably strong general need for Catholics to garner support for climate change policies, it cannot be said that there is a similarly strong general need for any particular policy instrument or another. Policy deliberations are an especially delicate matter of prudential judgment, informed by conscience, and as such, there are several climate change policies for which Catholics might appropriately advocate. Here, as Gaudium et Spes points out, it is especially incumbent on laypersons to concurrently bring their faith and professional expertise to bear on particular technicalities in service of the Church. And in this regard, with the various options in terms of trying to reduce emissions and greenhouse gases, that I think that they would probably favor taxes, the implementation of taxes, because it seems to be the most effective and seems to best address the power. So I won't go through all their quotes, but they seem to support that reality. There is also the Clean Power Plan, which talked about as one way of mitigating these greenhouse gases. Although these Catholic thinkers persuasively argue for a national price on carbon, no such policy mechanism is currently under consideration by American lawmakers. Instead, and in response to the unlikeliness that the current Congress would consider legislating a price on carbon, officials are working to regulate carbon pollution through the Clean Power Plan. As such, advocacy in support of the Clean Power Plan represents one way that American Catholics can practically respond to the problem of externality-driven climate change. The Clean Power Plan is EPA's proposed carbon pollution standards for existing power plants. The plan was finalized in August 2015, as indicated before, and its standards are expected to reduce power sector carbon pollution by 30% relative to 2005 levels. The plan empowers states to craft their own plans for meeting their respective carbon pollution reduction goals, and if successfully implemented, the Clean Power Plan is expected to produce climate and health benefits worth an estimated $55 billion to $93 billion in 2030, including avoiding 2,700 to 6,600 premature deaths and 140,000 to 150,000 asthma attacks in children. Given how the Clean Power Plan is designed to care for our common home, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops supports the Clean Power Plan and encourages American Catholics to do the same. At present, however, the plan is under stay from the U.S. Supreme Court in response to legal challenges by industry and Republican attorneys general from 23 states. In response, Catholics might exercise Laudato Si inspired faithful citizenship by urging governors to support the Clean Power Plan, advocating that states continue preparations to comply with the plan, and participating in the online advocacy campaign coordinated by the Catholic Climate Covenant. Catholics might also write op-eds and letters to the editor of their local newspapers highlighting how creation, care, and climate change are moral issues from the Catholic perspective. And the third thing is state and local policies that we might be effective in. In addition to advocating for Clean Power Plan, Catholics can also advocate around state and local energy policies. In 2008, for instance, The Ohio legislature passed with near unanimity statewide clean energy and energy efficiency standards. In 2014, however, the legislature passed Senate Bill 310, which sought to freeze and study these standards for 2 years. In response, the Ohio Catholic Conference asked lawmakers to prayerfully consider if it would be more prudent, for the sake of environmental stewardship, to maintain our current policies and not freeze these standards while the study takes place. Nevertheless, Governor John Kasich signed SB 310 into law, and now the Ohio legislature has proposed the companion measures, Senate Bill 320 and House Bill 554, to extend the freeze for another 3 years. A fourth way for Catholics to address the externalities that perpetuate ecologically destructive fossil fuel consumption by sending electric utilities market-based signals of support for clean energy. In other words, to send to these electric utilities support from consumers of how important it is. For example, Catholic individuals and communities can remove themselves and their rate payments from a non-renewable energy grid through the installation of on-site solar panels, for which there are available rebates, credits, and revolving loans. Additionally, Catholics can purchase renewable energy certificates from their utility to share their commitment to clean energy. Such demand-side support for clean energy might, in turn, embolden utilities to respond with investments in clean energy. In my own diocese of Des Moines, in Iowa, for example, the utility Mid-American Energy Company recently announced a $3.6 billion plan to build up to 2,000 additional megawatts of wind turbines. The announcement comes 3 years after the utility committed to invest up to $1.9 billion to expand its wind energy capacities, and 2 years after it announced plans to invest an additional $280 million in wind generation. According to Iowa's Republican Governor Terry Branstad, Mid-America's 280 wind investment in particular is made in order to meet the growing consumer demand for electricity through renewable energy. In other words, consumer demand for clean energy can move utilities to respond with more of what consumers want. And we might look at Mid-American Energy. Its principal owner is Warren Buffett. If you know, Warren is very interested in positive returns. He's not in it just necessarily only for the ethical approach to our resources. And so he has the resource of wind power, and we see in a very positive way that this particular industry in Iowa has created a lot of jobs in terms of the development of wind power, the production of the windmills, their installation, their ongoing maintenance. And so it has created a dynamic, a circular economic system that really is producing significant profits for Warren Buffett, and at the same time providing clean energy, almost up to 40% of our energy needs in the state of Iowa. So in that way, we see that even companies like Google and Facebook, which have huge energy demands, are going to places like Iowa because they want renewable energy, and so they're creating a demand of something that in the economic system, which is very valuable. And I think that's very important. We can have the ethics, but I think consumer demand, good old capitalist approach to things, can also have a terrific influence on the market. So finally, I want to talk about the Green Climate Fund. It is extremely important for Catholics, and indeed for all persons of faith and goodwill, to support public policies that seek to internalize the economic externalities which fuel ecological degradation and climate change. At the same time, however, we know that the adverse consequences of climate change are already harming people around the world. We also know that the emission trajectories mean that climate change will unquestionably harm people well into the future. Droughts are causing food and water stresses for producers and consumers around the world. More frequent severe weather events are damaging infrastructure and other demands of life. Given the current and unavoidable adverse humanitarian consequences of climate change, policies to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions must be coupled with those to help those impacted adapt to their new realities. This is especially so since those most harmed by climate change, as we have discussed before, are often the poor who have historically and thus unjustly done least to cause the problem. The Green Climate Fund is the United Nations financial mechanism by which developed nations can support climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts in developing nations. It is a key instrument through which the global north can repay the ecological debt that Pope Francis says in Laudato Si is owed to the south. And as the world's largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases, the U.S., under the Obama administration, has rightly made a significant pledge to support the fund. Although the U.S. has pledged funds to the Green Climate Fund, honoring this pledge will require Congress to authorize several payments in the coming years. Ahead of the most recent payment, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, along with the Catholic Relief Services and Catholic Charities USA, highlighted the moral imperative to do so and urged Congress to act accordingly. I hope that my remarks here today have provided helpful suggestions for how American Catholics can practically respond to the ecological vision outlined by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. Additionally, I hope that you have been inspired to think about how you, as an individual, and with your community and representation, can practically respond to the externalities that drive climate change, as well as the urgent need to provide financial adaptation to impacted and vulnerable persons and communities. Finally, I pray the conclusion of the prayer with which Pope Francis closes Laudato Si. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love. For all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor and the earth are crying out, O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you, O Lord. Amen.